never be a priest. That's what he told me. You will never be a priest because you don't have what it takes. Now, when I was growing up, my family taught me that God had a plan for my life. They helped me to understand that it's not only good to ask, what do I want to be when I grow up? It's even better to ask, what does God want me to be when I grow up? So I took that question seriously and wrestled with that question and finally concluded that God wanted me to be a monk in a monastery. So I joined a monastery, an abbey, back in 1985 when I finished college. And quite frankly, I loved it. I loved the prayer life. I loved the community life. I happily planned to spend the rest of my life at that abbey. And then, about 4 years into that experience, the priest who was in charge of the monastery sat me down, and from across his desk, he pointed his finger at me and he said, "You will never be a priest. You don't have what it takes." Well, with that, as you can imagine, I felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me. What do you do when the world you thought you were creating suddenly comes crashing down? What do you do when you've spent years trying to figure out how to serve God and be obedient to God, and you thought you were on the right path, only to be told, "Nope, you can't. You got it wrong"? What do you do? What did I do? Well, I cried some, and I was angry a lot, and I yelled at God. Frankly, it took almost a year for the emotional and spiritual dust to settle, and then I took a chance on prayer again, and God's gentle whispers eventually led me here, not to another abbey somewhere, but to the Diocese of Richmond, where I was ordained to be a parish priest in 1993. And as I look back on all of those experiences, I see that Christ has led me precisely where he wanted me to be. But in order for me to arrive in Virginia, I had to go through that painful, confusing experience of letting go of what I thought God wanted me to do, letting go of what I thought God's plan was, letting go of my dream, to discover that God's dream is even bigger and better. And that's how the boy from Pennsylvania ends up a parish priest in Virginia. And some people, upon hearing that story, might say that, well, I had wasted a lot of time by going to that monastery. After all, if I had gone to the seminary right out of college, I could have come to Virginia and been ordained years sooner. Some people have even asked me if I regret taking a wrong turn on the road that eventually led to Richmond. But with the gift of hindsight, I see how God was with me at every step of this twisty, windy journey. There was no wasted time. At every step of this journey, God was teaching me something about myself, and more importantly, God was teaching me even more about Jesus. Everything that happened back then helps to make me the Christian and priest I am today. And I can't imagine doing anything else and being this happy. This week, we celebrate a saint whose journey has many twists and turns. We celebrate a saint who experienced many disappointments, lots of challenges and losses. The rug was pulled out from under her many times. But she knew that God was with her. She knew that God was teaching her something important about Christ, and she believed what the angel Gabriel said in the Gospel of Luke. Nothing will be impossible for God. In the year 1381, a child named Rita was born near Cascia in the region of Perugia in Italy. Her parents taught Rita to love the Lord, and from an early age, she was devoted to prayer. She even created a little chapel for herself in a corner of their house. Her parents smiled as they saw their little girl being so serious about her daily prayers. Her parents smiled for a while, but their smiles turned to frowns when Rita eventually announced that she wanted to become a nun. In the nearby town of Cascia, there was a convent of Augustinian nuns, and occasionally Rita peered through the gate of that monastery, and she saw the nuns, and she heard them singing from their chapel, and she was inspired. She wanted to be part of that community. She prayed. Her parents had taught her that God had a plan for her life. She knew that we need to be obedient when God calls us to a specific path in life. So Rita prayed, and she became as certain as possible that she was called to be a nun with the Augustinians in Cascia. Finally, she worked up her courage to tell her parents this good news, and her parents said, "No, you will never be a nun." Not only did her parents announce that they would refuse to allow her permission to go to the convent, her parents also announced that they wanted Rita to get married. Talk about having the rug pulled out from under you. Rita had prayed. She was convinced that the Lord was calling her to the convent. She was certain that this was the right direction, and now the door slammed closed in her face. Yeah, she needed to be obedient to God, but didn't the Bible also teach us to respect and obey our parents? Rita's parents arranged a marriage. They frankly thought that they had found the perfect man for her, and he was perfect if the only measure of perfection is money. You see, he had some wealth. What he also had was a terrible temper. He was an angry and unfaithful man. Rita had thought that her life was heading this way, to the convent. Now she found herself headed that way, married to a difficult man. He was hard to live with. She tearfully spent some days sad, but praying for her difficult spouse, which, by the way, is always a very good thing to do, even if your spouse isn't difficult. That is, pray for your spouse. Pray for your children. Pray for your parents. The saints teach us how critical this is. Not only did Rita pray, she tried to respond to her husband and sons with kindness and patience, even when they weren't behaving the same way. The neighbors said that she tried to be good and do good to everyone. And eventually, her kindness began to change her husband's behavior for the better, at least when he was home. But then the rug got pulled out from under Rita again. Her husband was killed in a vendetta, and her two sons, following the custom, threatened to seek revenge on those who had killed their father. Rita prayed that her sons would not commit murder. And then her sons contracted a serious illness. Rita served as a nurse for her two sick sons, praying that they would release the hatred and the anger that they were holding in their hearts toward their father's killers. She reminded them that Christ had even forgiven the men who drove the nails into his flesh on the cross. Her sons did not recover from their illness. But before they died, they renounced their desire for vengeance. As one author put it, they died forgiving and forgiven. Let's take a pause for a moment here and look at the twists and turns in Rita's life. She thought she would be a nun. Her parents said no. They made her get married. Then she had children. Then she buries her husband and children. Where is God in all of these twists and turns? Rita believed that God was with her and that God wanted her still to join that monastery of nuns over in Cascia. So she worked up her courage and walked over there and told the superior of the monastery that she wanted to join the convent. And the superior said, no. The superior said, no, we don't accept candidates who were previously married. We don't accept candidates who have had children. Oh, and we don't accept candidates who cannot read. So now what? As Rita prayed, she kept sensing that God was leading her to that convent. She kept walking over there and asking, and the nuns kept saying, no. But Rita didn't give up. Maybe that's part of what makes her a saint. She sensed that God had not given up on her, so she did not give up. She decided to try again, so she walked over to Cascia, rang the bell, sat down with the superior of the Augustinian nuns, and she asked again to join the community again. And this time they said yes. Remember how obedient Rita was to her parents? Well, now she was obedient to the nuns in charge of the convent. She did whatever they asked her to do. She did penance, she fasted, she volunteered to take care of the sick nuns. She gained a reputation for being compassionate. When she met people who were suffering, she responded with gentleness. We might want to ask, well, where did that compassion come from? Well, throughout her life, when Rita prayed, she focused on what we call the passion of Jesus. The passion. That's everything that happened to Jesus from the time that he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane to the moment when he was placed in his tomb. In other words, Rita meditated on the sufferings of Jesus. She pondered how Jesus experienced rejection, how he invited people to love the Father, and how often they said no. She prayed about what Jesus must have felt when he was falsely accused, when he was mistreated, and as he carried his cross. By prayerfully focusing on the sufferings of Jesus, Rita came to understand that Jesus was with her in her sufferings. If she was rejected, she remembered how Christ was rejected. If people said no to her, she remembered how they had said no to Jesus. If she was mistreated, she recalled how Christ was mistreated. And she knew that whenever she had to carry the cross in her life, she was not alone. Christ was with her. And her compassion for the suffering of Jesus made her compassionate, caring, and patient toward the suffering of people around her. One day, as she was contemplating an image of Jesus wearing the crown of thorns on his head, a wound developed right here on Rita's forehead. And off and on for the rest of her life, that wound appeared there on her forehead. And you will often see St. Rita depicted with that wound on her forehead. Perhaps Rita was sharing in what we call the stigmata, that is, the physical wounds of Christ. Throughout our church's history, certain saints have experienced this kind of thing. St. Francis of Assisi famously developed wounds in his hands and his feet, which resembled the wounds of Jesus' crucifixion. Is it any wonder that this woman, Rita of Cascia, who had experienced difficulty and suffering and rejection in her life, might come to share in the wounds of Christ, even in her flesh? Christ's suffering gave her strength and hope. St. Rita of Cascia died on May 22nd, 1457. Her feast day is May 22nd, the day that she was born to eternal life. Her life indeed had taken many twists and turns. It had gone in many directions. Her path seemed to follow a winding road. My friend and mentor, Monsignor Michael McCarran, once said that Rita's journey toward fullness, her journey toward fullness, led her through many periods of emptiness. God was present to her always, even, perhaps especially, in the twists and turns of her life that were disappointing or full of rejection. Those moments in her life that appeared to be failures. Let's remember, she told her parents she wanted to be a nun. They said no, but God was leading her. Her parents arranged a marriage. He was a mean man, but God was with her. Her husband was killed. Her sons eventually died. The rug gets pulled out from under her again, but God is not done with her. She asks to enter the convent. They said no, again and again. Finally, they let her in. She focuses on the sufferings of Christ. Her own body appears to share those wounds, but she never becomes selfish. She's known for compassion. Rita took all of those hard, difficult experiences and she placed them into God's hands. And God worked through all of those difficult times in her life to make Rita a beautiful, inspiring example of Christian faithfulness and compassion. There are so many people who feel as if the rug has been pulled out from under them. So many people who are convinced that God has somehow abandoned them since life has not worked out the way we planned. So many people right now struggling and in pain. Perhaps St. Rita is our best helper, teacher, and companion in moments like this. In fact, she is called one of the patron saints of difficult and impossible situations. She teaches us what she learned in her own life. When someone else says no to us, God has a yes that we need to hear. When someone else tells us that we're not good enough or that our future is ruined because we've taken wrong turns in the past, St. Rita teaches us that God isn't finished with us yet, because God isn't finished loving us yet. And St. Rita teaches us that whatever we suffer, whenever we experience suffering, that suffering can remind us of how Christ suffered for all of us. And that perspective can make us compassionate and generous to the people around us who have had the rug pulled out from under them. Newness of life. That's what God promises. That's where God is leading us, always. Saint Rita, pray for us.